From her hospital bed, she scrolled past a cruise photo and stopped. There was her own family, laughing on a deck she had paid for without knowing it. Vanessa in a white sundress, sunglasses pushed up into blown-out hair. Her son Daniel with a drink in his hand the color of orange sherbet. His arm slung around a boy who used to fit in the crook of her elbow, and now came up to his father's shoulder. Bradley, her grandson. 11 years old and grinning at the camera like the whole ocean belonged to him. The caption read, "Family first, best week of our lives. #Caribbean, #blessed." Eleanor Voss lay very still in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and cold cotton, her hip held together with 2 titanium screws and a plate the surgeon had shown her on an X-ray the way you'd show someone a receipt. 68 hours since the surgery. 41 hours since they'd moved her out of recovery and into this narrow room with the beige curtain and the television bolted too high on the wall. And in that time, not one call from her son. Not one text. Only this, discovered by accident, because her physical therapist had asked if she wanted help setting up the hospital's guest Wi-Fi. And Eleanor, bored out of her mind and lonely in a way she hadn't let herself name yet, had opened Facebook to see what the world was doing without her. The world, it turned out, was doing quite well. Her family was doing especially well. She enlarged the photo with 2 fingers, the way her granddaughter Chloe had taught her, and she looked at the railing behind them, at the blue that stretched on forever, at the little plastic wristbands on her son's arm that meant somebody had paid for an all-inclusive package. She did the math without wanting to. 38 years of grading papers and standing at a chalkboard until her feet ached had taught her to do math quickly, quietly, and without mercy. A balcony suite for 4. Excursions. A spa day for Vanessa that had its own hashtag. This was not a cruise you booked on a school teacher's whim. This was $18,000, easily, maybe more. And she knew, with the particular cold certainty of a woman who had balanced a checkbook by hand for 50 years, exactly which account had paid for it. If you have ever had to stand up to your own family, I want you to tell me where you're watching this from, down in the comments. Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why it matters that you're not alone in this. But first, let me take you back, because you need to understand exactly how a 70-year-old widow ends up flat on her back in a hospital bed, staring at a photograph that would end up changing everything about the family she thought she had. My name is Eleanor Voss, and 3 years ago, I buried my husband. Walter had been a fire captain for 31 years, the kind of man who checked the smoke detectors in every room of the house on the 1st of every month without being asked. The kind of man who read the fine print on everything: insurance policies, mortgage documents, the pension paperwork that would one day matter more than either of us understood. He used to say that trust was a fine thing between people who loved each other, but paper was the only thing that held up in a courtroom. I loved him for 39 years, and I only understood how right he was after he was gone. When Walter died, I was 67 years old, and I had never once in my adult life managed a household account entirely on my own. Not because I couldn't, because we had always done it together, at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, with 2 cups of coffee going cold while we went over the bills. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, and the house got quiet in that particular way that only widows understand, my son Daniel came to me with an idea. "Mom," he said, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table, "let me help you with the accounts, just until you get your feet under you. I'll be added as an authorized user, that's all. Nothing changes. You're still in charge." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. I had raised him, potty trained him, sat up with him through chickenpox and a broken arm, and a divorce that left him raising his daughter Chloe mostly on his own for 2 years before he remarried. I had watched him struggle, and I had watched him land on his feet. And when he offered to help me, I thought, this is what family does. This is what Walter would have wanted, our son stepping up. So I drove to Heritage Trust Bank on a gray Tuesday in October, and I signed the paperwork that added Daniel Voss as an authorized user on the account that held my pension. 38 years of teaching 3rd grade. 38 years of report cards and parent-teacher conferences, and the particular exhaustion of standing in front of 26 8-year-olds 5 days a week, all of it distilled into a monthly deposit that Walter and I had always called the foundation. Because that's what it was, the foundation everything else got built on. I didn't read every line of that authorization form as carefully as I should have. I want to be honest with you about that, because this story only works if I'm honest with you. I trusted the bank to explain what mattered, and I trusted my son not to need it explained twice. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last one I made, but it was the one that opened the door for everything else. For the first year, things seemed fine. Daniel paid a few bills for me when my arthritis flared and I couldn't get to the mailbox. He called to check in. Vanessa, his wife, sent me pictures of Bradley's basketball games. I told myself I had a family that showed up for me, the way I had shown up for my own mother in her final years. But somewhere along the way, the checking in turned into checking on. And the checking on turned into a pattern I was too proud, or too lonely, or too afraid of being alone again to name out loud. There was the country club membership Daniel and Vanessa joined the year after Walter died. $340 a month that somehow got auto-drafted from an account with my name on it just until Daniel's bonus came through. There was Bradley's private school tuition, $1,200 a month, framed to me as a loan Daniel would pay back the second the commission checks caught up. There was Vanessa's boutique gym membership, $89 a month, that I only noticed once, buried in a statement, under a line item that simply read, wellness. Each time I asked, gently, the way you ask a grown child something you're afraid will make them defensive, Daniel had an answer ready. Smooth, reasonable, always just believable enough. Mom, it's temporary. Mom, you don't need to worry about the details. That's the whole point of me helping you. Mom, honestly, you're not exactly sharp with numbers anymore. Let me handle it. That last one, he said more than once, usually with a little laugh at the end, like it was a joke between us, like I was supposed to laugh too. I want you to remember that phrase. Not exactly sharp with numbers anymore. Hold on to it, because we are going to come back to it. And when we do, I want you to feel exactly what I felt the day I finally understood what those words had really meant all along. There was one person in that house who never once looked at me the way Daniel and Vanessa did. Like a problem to be managed. Like a resource to be budgeted around. My granddaughter, Chloe. Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, 20 years old now, studying nursing at the state college an hour away, home most weekends because, as she put it, somebody in this family has to check on Grandma without an agenda. Chloe had never liked Vanessa, not since Vanessa slid into the family when Chloe was 8 and made it clear, in the particular cruelty that only a certain kind of stepmother can manage, that Chloe was a complication rather than a daughter. Chloe had grown up watching her father's second family get the vacations, the new cars, the private school, while she wore hand-me-downs and worked a part-time job since she was 15. She never said a bitter word about it to me. She just showed up every single time, with groceries or a fixed faucet, or an afternoon of just sitting with me watching old movies. Chloe was the one who drove me to the emergency room the night I fell. It happened on a Thursday evening in early June, on the back steps of my own house, carrying a watering can out to the tomato plants Walter had built the raised beds for years before he died. My hip gave out. Not slipped, not tripped. Gave out, the way things do sometimes when you're 70 and your bones have quietly been losing a fight you didn't know you were in. I went down hard onto the concrete, and I lay there in the June evening light for 11 minutes before I managed to reach my phone in my cardigan pocket and call Chloe, because I did not, in that moment of pain and humiliation, think to call my son. Isn't that the kind of thing you only notice after? That in the worst moment of your physical life, your instinct didn't reach for the person who was supposed to be closest to you. It reached for the one who had actually earned it. Daniel and Vanessa were, according to what I pieced together later, at a wine tasting event that Thursday evening. Bradley was at a friend's house. Chloe drove 90 minutes with her hazards blinking the whole way, sat with me in the emergency room until 2 in the morning, held my hand while a doctor with tired eyes told me I had fractured my hip and would need surgery within the week. She was the one who called Daniel. She was the one who had to leave 3 voicemails before he called back the next morning, mildly annoyed, as though she had interrupted something. I remember lying in that emergency room bed, waiting for a room to open up, and hearing Chloe on the phone in the hallway, her voice tight and controlled the way mine gets when I am trying very hard not to cry in public. "Dad, she broke her hip. She needs surgery. I need you here." And then a long pause. And then, in a voice flat with disbelief, "Vanessa's spa appointment? Are you serious right now?" They came to see me exactly once before the surgery. 15 minutes. Daniel checked his watch twice. Vanessa complained about the parking garage. Bradley didn't come at all because, as Daniel explained, he had a travel soccer tournament and it would be a shame to make him miss it. The surgery went well, all things considered. 2 screws, 1 plate, a surgeon who told me I'd walk with a cane for a few months, and then, with physical therapy, probably not need it at all. I remember waking from anesthesia, grateful, disoriented, and, underneath all of it, quietly waiting for my son to walk through the door. He didn't come the first day. He texted. He didn't come the second day either. Vanessa posted a photo of herself at brunch with the caption, "Sunday Reset." And then, on the 3rd day, while I was scrolling through a Wi-Fi connection I didn't really know how to use, bored and lonely, and trying to feel less invisible in a room that smelled like rubbing alcohol, I found the photograph that started all of this. My family, laughing on a deck I had paid for without knowing it. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next, because I think it matters. I am not, and have never been, a vengeful woman. I spent 38 years teaching small children the alphabet and patience, and how to apologize when they hurt someone. I believe still in second chances, in grace, in the idea that people we love can disappoint us without it meaning the love was never real. But I also spent 38 years learning how to grade fairly, how to look at evidence and not flinch from what it actually says, even when what it says breaks your heart. The evidence, laid out on that hospital tray table in front of me, said that my son had taken my pension while I was unconscious in an operating room and used it to buy his family a vacation. And it said something else, too, something colder, something I would only fully understand over the following weeks. It said that somewhere along the way, my son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an account. I set the phone down on the tray table. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking. I had expected them to shake. Instead, there was a strange stillness settling into my chest, the kind of quiet I remembered from standing at the front of a classroom on the worst days, when 26 children were watching to see whether I would fall apart, and I did not, because falling apart was not going to help anyone in that room. I picked the phone back up and I called my son. He answered on the fourth ring, and there was noise behind him, a low hum of voices, something that might have been a hymn, or might have been a steel drum band 3,000 miles away doing a passable imitation of one. "Hey, Mom," he said, breezy, easy, a man with nothing at all to hide. "Can't really talk right now. We're at church." At church. I looked at the ceiling of that hospital room, at the water stain in the corner tile that I had already memorized over 3 sleepless nights, and I felt something in me go very calm and very cold at the same time, the way water does right before it turns to ice. "At church," I repeated. "Yeah, Sunday service. You know how it is." A gull cried somewhere behind him, unmistakably. A gull, and then a muffled announcement, garbled but distinctly nautical, the kind of thing you hear over a ship's intercom telling passengers where to be for the 4 o'clock excursion. "Well," I said, and I want you to understand that my voice did not rise, did not crack, did not do any of the things a lesser woman's voice might have done in that moment. "Enjoy the view from the pews. I hear the light out there this time of year is lovely." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a small, telling silence, the sound of a man realizing, 1/2 second too late, that his mother was not as easy to fool as he had built his entire life around assuming. "Mom, I have physical therapy in 10 minutes, I said, which was true and also entirely beside the point. "We'll talk when you're home from services." I hung up the phone. I set it face down on the tray table, next to the plastic water pitcher and the folded discharge pamphlet about hip precautions I hadn't read yet. And then I sat there, in that narrow bed, in that room that smelled like antiseptic and cold cotton, and I did something I had not done since the day of Walter's funeral. I let myself cry, quietly, for exactly 4 minutes by the clock on the wall. Then I wiped my face with the corner of the hospital blanket, and I picked the phone back up, and I called Heritage Trust Bank. I did not know, when I made that call, that the account my son had drained had a cosigner clause he had never bothered to read. I did not know it had a beneficiary structure that would matter more than any of us understood. I only knew one thing, in that moment, with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've stopped protecting yourself from a truth you already sensed. My son had lied to me from 3,000 miles away on a ship he'd paid for with my money, and he had done it easily, the way you lie to someone you no longer believe can catch you. He had no idea, not yet, exactly what he had just woken up. The woman who answered the phone at Heritage Trust Bank had a warm, unhurried voice, the kind that made you picture cardigans and reading glasses on a chain. Her name was Denise Calloway, and she was, as it turned out, the branch manager, a fact I would come to be deeply, permanently grateful for over the following weeks. "Mrs. Voss," she said, once I'd given her my account number and answered the security questions, "how can I help you today?" "I need a full transaction history," I said, "for the last 18 months, every charge. And I need to understand something about my account that nobody has ever fully explained to me." There was a pause, the particular pause of a professional who senses something is wrong before she has any of the facts. "Of course. Let me pull that up. Can I ask what prompted this?" I told her. Not everything, not yet. I was too tired and too raw for the whole story in one phone call, lying in a hospital bed with a hip held together by hardware and a heart held together by something considerably less sturdy. but I told her about the cruise photograph. I told her my son had a card linked to my pension account. I told her he'd used it to charge what looked like a very expensive vacation while I was recovering from surgery and hadn't told me a word about it. Denise Calloway went quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. Still warm, but sharper now, focused, the voice of someone who had just picked up a scent she didn't like. "Mrs. Voss, I'm going to need a few minutes to review your file properly. Can I call you back within the hour?" She called back in 40 minutes. And what she told me, over the course of that phone call and 3 more that followed it, would end up changing not just what happened to my son, but how I understood every single thing that had happened in my family for the last 3 years. I set the phone down on the tray table while I waited for her to call back, and in that 40-minute silence, I found myself doing something I had not let myself do in 3 years. I let myself remember, honestly, without softening any of it, exactly how Walter had built that account in the first place. It was the autumn of 1998, a Sunday afternoon with the leaves coming down hard outside our kitchen window, and Walter had come home from the funeral of a man named Frank Delgado, a firefighter he'd served alongside for nearly 2 decades. Frank's mother had died 3 months earlier, and it was only after her funeral that the family discovered a home health aide, a woman they'd trusted with a house key and a grocery list, had been quietly writing herself checks against the old woman's savings account for the better part of 2 years. $61,000 gone, a number that had seemed, at the time, almost unimaginable to me. Walter had sat at our kitchen table that evening, still in his good funeral suit, and he had not said much, which was unusual for him, because Walter was a man who generally had a great deal to say about anything that troubled him. "Eleanor," he finally said, turning his water glass slowly on the table without drinking from it, "I want to build something for you that can't just be walked out the door. Not because I don't trust you to manage money, because I know what happens to people, good people, honest people, when they get old and tired and somebody decides being tired is the same thing as being foolish." I remember laughing, gently, and telling him he was being morbid, that we had decades ahead of us, that this was not a conversation we needed to have on a Sunday with leaves blowing against the window pane. He had looked at me then with an expression I would not fully understand until this very week, 70 years old, lying in a hospital bed 40 minutes into a phone call that was about to unmake everything I thought I knew about my own family. "Humor me," he'd said. "I'd rather build the fence before the storm than repair the fence after." We drove to Heritage Trust Bank together the following Tuesday, and I remember the loan officer at the time, a young man barely out of college, looking faintly amused at the extra paperwork Walter insisted on. The callback verification, the withdrawal threshold, the payable on death designation naming his sister Margaret as beneficiary, in case something happened to both of us at once. Walter read every single line of that document twice before he signed it. I remember teasing him about it in the parking lot afterward, asking him if he thought I was going to turn into some kind of criminal mastermind in my old age, and he had laughed, the real laugh, the one that used to fill up whatever room he was standing in, and said, "No, Eleanor, I just think the people who love us aren't always the same people who end up managing us. I want the paper to remember what the people might forget." I did not understand, sitting in that parking lot in the autumn of 1998, exactly how prophetic that sentence would turn out to be. I understood it now, lying in a hospital bed 28 years later, with a photograph of my own family laughing on a cruise ship still glowing faintly on the screen of my phone. A nurse came in during those 40 minutes, a young woman named Priya with kind eyes and a clipboard, to check my vitals and adjust the drip on my IV line. She must have noticed something in my face, because she paused before she left the room, her hand resting lightly on the bed rail. "You doing okay, Mrs. Voss? You look like you got some news." "I did," I told her, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded, saying it out loud to a stranger for the first time. Not the kind you'd expect from a doctor, the kind you get from a bank. She gave me a small, careful smile, the particular smile of someone who has learned, in a hospital, not to pry, but also not to pretend she hadn't noticed. My grandmother went through something like that a few years back, she said quietly. Her own son. It's more common than people think. You'd be surprised how many of us in here have a story just like whatever's sitting behind your eyes right now. I thought about that long after she left the room. How many women, lying in beds just like this one, in hospitals just like this one, all across the country, had discovered, at their most physically vulnerable, that the people who were supposed to be guarding the door had instead been quietly letting themselves in and out of it for years. I did not feel less alone, exactly, hearing that, but I felt something adjacent to it, something that made the 4 minutes of crying I'd allowed myself earlier feel a little less like weakness and a little more like the ordinary cost of being blindsided by someone you loved. Chloe arrived not long after Priya left, dropping her backpack onto the vinyl chair by the window with the particular exhausted energy of a nursing student who had come straight from a clinical rotation without stopping to eat. She took one look at my face and set her water bottle down without drinking from it. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, really. A demand, gentle but immediate. The tone of someone who had spent 2 years learning to read the fine print of my expressions the way her grandfather used to read the fine print of contracts. "I called the bank," I told her. "I'm waiting for them to call back." About the cruise. About the cruise. About the account. About a great many things I think I've been choosing not to look at too closely for longer than I want to admit. I patted the edge of the bed, and she came and sat beside me, the way she used to when she was small, before her father's second marriage, before Vanessa, before any of the slow architecture of exclusion that had shaped so much of her childhood. We sat together in that quiet, the television murmuring low in the corner, the hallway outside filled with the ordinary sounds of a hospital going about its business, carts rattling, a call bell chiming somewhere down the corridor, a pair of orderlies laughing quietly about something that had nothing to do with either of us. I thought about Walter, about the fence he'd built before the storm, about a man who had understood, decades before either of us had any reason to need it, that love without structure eventually leaves the people you love with nothing solid to stand on when the wind actually comes. I thought about the word he'd used in that parking lot all those years ago. Remember. I want the paper to remember what the people might forget. My son had forgotten. Or perhaps, more precisely, he had simply never bothered to learn in the first place, confident that nothing on paper would ever matter as much as his own easy charm, his own comfortable assumption that his mother's account existed, ultimately, for his convenience. He was about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption had always been. The phone rang at last, sitting there on the tray table beside the water pitcher and the pamphlet I still hadn't finished reading, and I watched Chloe's shoulders straighten, the same way mine did, both of us bracing without quite meaning to, the way you brace before a wave you can already see coming but have decided finally not to run from. I picked it up on the second ring. "Mrs. Voss," Denise Calloway said, and there was something in her voice now, something more careful than before, the tone of a woman who had spent the last 40 minutes reading a story she clearly wished she wasn't the one having to tell. "Thank you for your patience. I've had a chance to review everything, and I think it's best if I walk you through this from the beginning, because there's quite a bit here, and some of it is going to matter more than you might expect." The account my husband Walter had set up decades earlier, back when he was still a young fire captain worried about what would happen to me if anything ever happened to him, was not a simple checking account. It was structured as what Heritage Trust called a legacy pension trust account, designed specifically to receive my monthly pension deposits and hold them with an extra layer of protection. Walter had insisted on that layer after a coworker of his, a fellow firefighter, had lost his elderly mother's savings to a home health aide who'd gotten access to her checkbook. Walter had come home from that funeral and sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Eleanor, I want to build something that can't just be walked out the door." The clause he'd insisted on was simple, and as it turned out, exactly the kind of thing my son had never bothered to read. Any single withdrawal, or any cumulative monthly withdrawal, exceeding $2,000 required a verbal verification call to me personally, the primary account holder, using a callback number on file. It didn't matter who else had access to the account. It didn't matter whose name was on a linked card. The bank was contractually required to call me and confirm before releasing funds above that threshold. "Mrs. Voss," Denise said, and I could hear something in her voice that sounded almost like she was bracing herself. That verification call should have happened for every one of these transactions. "I'm looking at your statement now, and I'm seeing multiple withdrawals over the 18-month threshold you asked about that never should have cleared without that call being made." "How is that possible?" I asked, though some cold, still part of me already suspected the answer. It came down to a mistake, the kind of small human error that becomes enormous once you trace where it leads. 2 years earlier, a temporary teller, filling in during a staffing shortage, had issued my son a debit card linked directly to the trust account, coded incorrectly as a standard joint account rather than a protected legacy trust. The safeguard Walter had built, the one thing designed to catch exactly this kind of situation, had been quietly disabled by a data entry error nobody had caught, because nobody had ever needed to test it. Until now. "I am so sorry," Denise said, and she meant it. I could hear that she meant it. "This should never have happened. I need you to know that as of this call, I am flagging every transaction over that threshold as unauthorized, as beginning a formal fraud review. But Mrs. Voss, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, because it's going to matter. Did you knowingly authorize your son to spend from this account beyond paying bills on your behalf?" I thought about the country club dues, the tuition payments framed as loans that were never repaid, the gym membership buried under wellness. I thought about 3 years of small erosions I had allowed because I loved my son and did not want to believe what the pattern was telling me. "I authorized him to help with bills," I said slowly. "I did not authorize $18,000 for a cruise while I was in surgery. I did not authorize a country club membership. I don't believe I ever fully understood how much had already gone out this door before this week." "Then I think," Denise said, "we need to pull your complete history, all of it, not just 18 months. I want to see the whole picture before we decide what comes next." What we found over the following days, while I lay in that hospital bed working through physical therapy exercises with a walker and a patience I did not know I still had, was worse than either of us expected. Not catastrophically worse, not the kind of worse that ends in bankruptcy, but worse in the way that betrayal always is once you finally let yourself count it honestly. Over 14 months, in addition to the $18,460 charged directly to the cruise, my son had drawn down my pension account by an additional $26,900. Country club dues, private school tuition framed as loans, a truck payment for 4 months during a stretch Daniel had described to me as, "Just a rough patch, Mom, don't worry about it." Vanessa's gym membership, a designer handbag purchase disguised in the transaction log under a vague merchant code that I later learned retailed for $2,200. $45,360. That was the total. $45,000 of 38 years of chalk dust and grading papers and standing on my feet in a third-grade classroom until my back ached, quietly siphoned out of an account my husband had built specifically to protect me from exactly this kind of thing. I did not cry again after that call. I want you to understand that. Something in me had moved past crying and into a colder, clearer place. The place I imagine soldiers describe, or surgeons. The place where feeling everything all at once would get in the way of doing what needed to be done. There was a second piece of information Denise gave me that day, almost as an afterthought, that would end up mattering more than anything else in this entire story. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "I also want to make sure you're aware of the beneficiary structure on this account, since it seems like there may be some confusion in your family about how it works." I told her I wasn't entirely sure I understood it myself. "The account has a payable on death designation," she explained. "That means when you pass, the remaining balance transfers directly to a named beneficiary, outside of your will, outside of probate, immediately and without dispute. Your husband set this up in 2003. The named beneficiary on file is not your son." I sat up so fast in that hospital bed that a nurse 2 rooms down probably heard the machine beside me register the spike. "Who is it?" I asked. "Margaret Voss," Denise read, "listed as your sister-in-law, with a note in the file indicating she predeceased in 2019, which means legally the designation has lapsed and reverted to your estate unless you update it. Mrs. Voss, I'd strongly recommend, once you're able, that you come in and name a new beneficiary. Right now, this account would go through your general estate, which your son may well assume includes him by default." I thought about my son on that ship, laughing on a deck he thought was simply his due. A man who had spent 3 years quietly assuming that my accounts, my pension, my foundation, as Walter and I used to call it, belonged to him in some unspoken future tense. An inheritance he didn't need to wait politely for, because he'd already started collecting early installments. He had never once asked me who the beneficiary was. He had simply assumed. And in assuming, he had never bothered to learn the one fact that would have told him exactly how much power I still held. Quietly, the entire time he thought he was the one in control. "Ms. Calloway," I said, "I'd like to update that beneficiary as soon as I'm discharged. And I'd like to revoke my son's authorized user status on this account, effective immediately." "I can begin that process today," she said, "over the phone, with your verbal authorization and the forms I'll email to your granddaughter, if that's easier for you right now." "That would be wonderful," I said, though even as I said it, I felt the small, private hesitation that comes with realizing you are about to hand a piece of your own protection to someone else's hands, however trusted those hands might be. Denise must have heard something in my voice, because she paused before continuing, giving me the space I hadn't realized I needed. "Mrs. Voss, I want you to know there's no rush on any of this," she said. "What I can do today, with just your verbal consent, is restore the verification safeguard your husband put on this account, the one that coding error quietly disabled. That takes effect immediately, within the hour typically, and from that moment, nothing over $2,000 moves out of this account without me calling you first. Revoking your son's authorized user status altogether is a little more involved, since it requires a notarized form, and so does the beneficiary update. But I can have both emailed wherever is most convenient for you, and we can walk through them together over the phone once you're home, if that would help." "I think I'd like that," I said. I don't want to make a mistake with this. I've made enough of those already." "You haven't made a mistake," Denise said, and there was something firm in her voice now, something that reminded me, unexpectedly, of the way Walter used to speak when he wanted a point to actually land rather than simply be heard. "You trusted your son. That isn't a mistake, Mrs. Voss. That's just what mothers do. The mistake, if there is one in this story, belongs entirely to him and to whoever coded that card wrong 2 years ago. Not to you." I sat with that for a moment, the phone warm against my ear, the hospital room quiet except for the low murmur of the television and the distant rattle of a cart somewhere down the hall. I thought about all the ways, over 3 years, I had quietly absorbed small doubts about myself instead of directing them where they actually belonged. Am I too demanding? Am I imagining the pattern? Am I the kind of mother who counts pennies instead of trusting her own son? I had asked myself those questions more times than I could count, and not once in 3 years had I asked the far more obvious question sitting underneath all of them. Was he the kind of son who deserved that trust in the first place? "Thank you for saying that," I told Denise, and I meant it more than the simple words probably conveyed. "It's true," she said. "I've been doing this job for 19 years, Mrs. Voss. I've had this exact conversation more times than I wish I had. The pattern is almost always the same. Someone trusts a family member because that's what family is supposed to be for. The family member decides, somewhere along the way, that trust is the same thing as permission. And by the time anyone notices, it's not really about the money anymore. It's about understanding that the person you built your whole life around protecting turned out to be the one you needed protection from." I thought, in that moment, about Walter. About the fence he had insisted on building before any storm had ever threatened us. About the quiet, careful foresight of a man who had understood, decades before either of us needed it, that love was not the same thing as safety, and that the two needed to be built separately, side by side, so that one could survive even if the other was tested. My husband used to say that paper remembers what people forget, I told Denise, surprising myself slightly by saying it out loud to someone who had never met him. I think I finally understand what he meant by that. "He sounds like he was a wise man," Denise said gently. "He was," I said. "I only wish it hadn't taken me this long, and this much, to start listening properly to everything he tried to teach me." There was a brief, comfortable silence on the line, the kind that happens between two people who have, without quite intending to, moved from a transaction into something more human. Then Denise's voice shifted back into its practical register, gentle but efficient. A woman with other calls waiting and a job that required her to hold both compassion and competence at the same time. "Let's get that safeguard restored right now, while we're on the phone," she said. "And for the revocation and beneficiary forms, is there someone with you today who could help you receive that email and print it? Or would you rather I mail paper copies to the house?" I looked across the room, past the tray table with its water pitcher and its still unfinished pamphlet about hip precautions, toward the vinyl chair by the window where Chloe sat with her nursing textbook open on her lap, her eyes flicking up toward me every few minutes with the quiet, watchful attention of someone who had spent years learning to notice when the people she loved needed something before they had to ask for it. I thought about the folder she would, within the hour, pull from her own backpack without my even knowing it existed yet. I thought about a girl who had spent 2 years keeping receipts and screenshots and dates, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had understood, long before I did, that someone in this family needed to be paying attention. "My granddaughter is here with me," I said. "I think she'd be glad to help." "Perfect," Denise said. "I'll send them to whatever email is easiest, and we can walk through the notarization steps once you're both ready. Take your time, Mrs. Voss. There's no version of this where moving slowly costs you anything. The only person who benefits from you rushing is someone hoping you won't look closely enough at what you're signing." I thanked her, and we settled the details. And when I finally set the phone down on the tray table for the second time that day, I felt something in my chest that I had not expected to feel yet, not that early into all of this. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to the particular relief of finally, after 3 years of small doubts and quiet erosions, standing on ground that felt solid again beneath me. When I explained to Chloe what I needed, her face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Relief, fury. And underneath both of those, something that looked almost like vindication. Like a truth she'd been carrying alone for years had finally been spoken out loud by someone else. "Grandma," she said quietly, closing the textbook, "I need to tell you something, and I should have told you a long time ago." I did not press her right away. I have learned, over 38 years of standing in front of children who needed to say something difficult, that if you rush a person toward the truth, they often retreat from it instead. So I simply took her hand, the same way I used to when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms, and I waited. Because I remembered, sitting there in that hospital bed, exactly how small Chloe used to be when thunderstorms frightened her, and exactly how much of her childhood had been spent learning to be quiet about the things that frightened her in other ways, too. I thought, in that pause, about a summer afternoon nearly 12 years earlier, not long after Daniel married Vanessa, when Chloe was 8 years old and Bradley had not yet been born, and Vanessa had thrown herself a birthday party disguised as a family barbecue, though it was, in fact, entirely about her. There had been a cake, 3 tiers, delivered from a bakery 40 minutes away, and Chloe, who did not yet fully understand the architecture of the household she'd been placed into, had asked, sweetly, innocently, if she could help blow out the candles, the way children do when they want, more than anything, simply to be included in a moment that looks joyful. Vanessa had laughed, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either, the particular laugh of a woman drawing a boundary she did not feel any need to explain. "Sweetheart, this is Mommy's cake," she'd said, though Chloe had never once called her Mommy, not before that day and not after it. "Maybe next time we'll get you your own little cupcake." There had been no next time. There was never, in 12 years, a little cupcake. I remembered standing near the drinks table that afternoon, watching my 8-year-old granddaughter's face do the thing that children's faces do when they are learning, far too early, how to make themselves smaller so as not to be a bother, and I remembered walking over and taking her hand and telling her that her grandfather and I had a slice of cake waiting for her at our house, whenever she wanted it, and that she could blow out as many candles there as she liked, any day of the year, because at our house, every day she visited was a celebration of her simply existing. Walter had built her a swing that same summer, out behind the tomato beds, sturdy enough to hold a grown woman because, he said, a child should have somewhere in the world that was built specifically for her and not simply borrowed from someone else's celebration. Chloe used that swing until she was 14 years old, and even now, at 20, she would sit on it sometimes on quiet afternoons, her sneakers dragging slow furrows into the dirt beneath it, The way you returned to a place that once told you, without needing words, that you were wanted. I understood, watching her steady herself in that vinyl hospital chair 12 years later, that whatever she was about to tell me had cost her something similar to what that swing had once given her. A place to finally put weight down, after years of learning to carry things alone. "Take your time," I told her gently. She nodded, wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, and folded her hands in her lap the way she used to when she was preparing to recite something she'd memorized and was afraid of getting wrong. "I've been wanting to tell you things for a long time, Grandma," she said. "Little things, mostly, that never seemed like enough on their own to say out loud. The way Vanessa talks about you when you're not around. The way Dad changed after you added him to the account. I used to think I was imagining it, or being unfair, because I know I've never liked her, and I didn't want you to think I was just saying things to cause trouble." "I would never think that of you," I said, and I meant it entirely. "I know that now," she said. "I don't think I always believed it, though. I think some part of me was always a little afraid that if I said the wrong thing, I'd lose you too. You're the only person in this family who's ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere without having to earn it first." I felt something crack open in my chest, hearing her say that. A grief that had nothing to do with the money, and everything to do with how long a child in my own family had carried that particular fear without my knowing. I thought of Walter's swing, dragging slow furrows in the dirt behind the tomato beds, and I thought, not for the first time that week, about how much quiet suffering can happen inside a family that looks, from the outside, entirely ordinary. "You have never had to earn anything with me," I told her. "Not one single day of your life. I need you to hear that, and I need you to believe it, because whatever you tell me next, that is not going to change." She nodded, took a breath the way I imagined she had been taught to do before difficult conversations with patients during her clinical rotations. Steady, deliberate. The breath of someone preparing to deliver news she wished she didn't have to deliver. "There's a lot," she said. "I want to tell you all of it, not to hurt you, because I think you deserve to actually see the whole picture instead of just this one piece of it." "Then tell me," I said. "All of it. I am not going anywhere, and I am not going to break." And she believed me, I think, because something in her posture shifted then. The tight, careful posture of a girl who had spent years measuring every word before she said it, loosening into something closer to relief. She reached for the water bottle she still hadn't opened, took a long drink, and set it down beside the manila folder she had not yet pulled from her backpack, though I did not know that folder existed yet, not in that exact moment, not until she reached for it a few minutes later with hands that were, for the first time in longer than I could remember, no longer shaking. Outside the window, the light had shifted toward late afternoon, the particular gold that comes right before a summer evening settles in. And somewhere down the hallway, a food cart rattled past, carrying trays toward rooms full of other families, other quiet griefs, other conversations nobody outside those four walls would ever hear. I thought, in that strange, suspended moment before Chloe began to speak in earnest, that this was perhaps the truest version of family I had access to anymore. Not the one bound by blood and photographs on a cruise ship deck, but the one sitting beside my hospital bed, finally unafraid to tell me the truth because she trusted, at last, that I was strong enough to hear it. "Okay," Chloe said quietly, and reached for the folder. What Chloe told me that afternoon, in a hospital room with the television murmuring a game show neither of us was watching, would take the whole picture I had already assembled and turn it into something sharper, something with teeth. She told me that Vanessa had, more than once, referred to me in front of her as the bank, a joke among Daniel's side of the family that Chloe had never found funny. She told me that the cruise had been planned for 4 months, not a spontaneous treat, and that Daniel had specifically waited until after my surgery date was confirmed to book it, because, in Vanessa's words that Chloe had overheard through a closed door, She'll be too doped up on painkillers to check her statements for weeks. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to sit with it for a lot longer than a moment. My family had looked at the calendar, at the date of my hip surgery, at the projected recovery window, and had used it, planned around it, treated my pain and my helplessness as a convenient blackout window in which to spend money they had no right to. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked her, not with anger, because none of this was Chloe's fault, but with the particular ache of realizing how alone she must have felt, carrying that knowledge inside a family that had never once made room for her voice. "Because every time I tried to say anything," Chloe said, her eyes bright but her voice steady, "Dad would say I was jealous or dramatic or trying to cause problems because Vanessa and I don't get along. And I thought, if I say something and I'm wrong, I lose the only grandmother I have left. So I just started keeping receipts, screenshots, dates, just in case." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder, thick with printouts, and set it gently on my hospital tray table, next to the water pitcher and the pamphlet about hip precautions I still hadn't finished reading. "Just in case," she said again, quieter this time. I looked at that folder for a long moment before I opened it. Inside were screenshots of Instagram posts with timestamps, a photo of a cruise itinerary email Chloe had glimpsed on the family printer months earlier and photographed on her phone before Vanessa could shred it. Receipts for the truck payments Daniel had described as temporary. A text thread between Vanessa and a friend, forwarded to Chloe by accident, joking about Grandma's little nest egg funding their vacation. It was not proof a courtroom would necessarily need, not on its own. But it was proof of something I needed far more urgently in that moment. It was proof that I had not imagined the pattern, that the quiet, creeping unease I'd felt for 3 years and dismissed again and again as an old woman's paranoia had been real the entire time. He had no idea, lying on a deck chair 3,000 miles away with a drink the color of orange sherbet, that his own daughter had spent 2 years quietly building the case against him, one screenshot at a time. The days that followed blurred together in the particular way hospital days do, marked less by clocks than by the rhythm of physical therapy sessions, vital sign checks, and the slow, humiliating relearning of how to walk with a walker down a beige hallway while a therapist named Miguel counted my steps out loud like I was a child again. I did not call Daniel back that first day, and he did not call me either, which told me something in itself. A son with nothing to hide calls his mother back within the hour when she hangs up on him mid-sentence. A son who understands, on some level he probably hasn't admitted to himself yet, exactly what he's done, waits, buys time, hopes the moment passes before he has to face it. It gave me time too, and I used it. Denise Calloway called every day with updates. The fraud review had officially opened. Every transaction above the $2,000 threshold over the past 14 months was being formally flagged as unauthorized, pending my written confirmation, which meant that Heritage Trust Bank, not just me personally, now had a documented interest in what my son had done. That mattered more than I initially understood. A bank does not like discovering that an employee error allowed $45,000 to move through a protected account without the safeguards its own policies required. Denise, I would learn later, was not just being kind to a sympathetic elderly customer. She was protecting her branch from liability, and our interests, for once, ran in exactly the same direction. On my 5th day in the hospital, I asked Chloe to help me find an elder law attorney. I did not know, at 70 years old, that such a specialty existed, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed asking, as if admitting I needed a lawyer who specialized in protecting people like me was its own small defeat. Chloe found 3 names within an hour, all with strong reviews, and I chose the one whose office was closest to the hospital, a man named Marcus Whitfield, because I did not have the patience in that particular week of my life to travel far for anything. Marcus Whitfield came to see me in person 2 days later, a tall man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a leather folio under his arm. And he listened to my entire story without interrupting once, which I found, after 3 years of being spoken over and around by my own family, to be an almost radical kindness. "Mrs. Voss," he said when I finished, "I want to be very clear with you about what we're dealing with here, because I think it will help you make decisions with a clear head instead of a hurt one. What your son did is not simply a family disagreement about money. Depending on how we proceed, this may legally constitute financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under state law. You are 70 years old. You were recovering from major surgery during the period in question, and the transactions in question were made without your authorization by someone with fiduciary access to your account. That is a very serious combination." "I don't want to send my son to prison, Mr. Whitfield," I said, and I meant it, even then, even furious, even betrayed in ways I was still discovering the full shape of. "I want my money protected. I want him to understand what he did. I don't know that I want him in handcuffs. That's your choice to make. And we have options that don't require criminal charges," he said. "But I want you to understand the leverage you have, because right now, I don't think your son does. You have the ability to file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services. You have the ability to pursue civil restitution for the full amount taken. You have a bank that is already cooperating fully because they have their own liability to manage. And you have a beneficiary designation on that account that your son has apparently never bothered to verify, which tells me he has been operating this entire time on an assumption of inheritance he never actually secured." He paused, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. The practiced neutrality of an attorney giving way to something more human. "Mrs. Voss, in my experience, people like your son rely on one thing above everything else. They rely on the people they've wronged staying quiet, staying grateful, staying small, because they've been trained to. The moment you stop being quiet, the entire structure they built on top of your silence collapses. That's not cruelty on your part. That's just gravity, doing what gravity does once you remove what was propping something up." I thought about that phrase for a long time after he left. Gravity, doing what gravity does. I thought about 38 years of standing at the front of a classroom, teaching children that actions have consequences, that you cannot borrow another person's crayons without asking and expect no one to notice when the box comes back empty. I had taught that lesson 600 times over the course of my career, patiently, gently, to 8-year-olds who mostly learned it. My own son, at 44 years old, had apparently never learned it at all. I was discharged from the hospital 11 days after my surgery, walking with a cane, moving slowly, my hips still tender in a way that made every step a small, deliberate negotiation. Chloe drove me home in her second-hand sedan, and when we pulled into the driveway of the house Walter and I had raised our family in, the house with the tomato beds he'd built with his own hands, I noticed something that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. The lawn had not been mowed in 3 weeks. The mail had piled up in the box until it wouldn't close. Nobody, in 11 days, had come by to check on the house of the woman whose money had paid for a family vacation to the Caribbean. Nobody except Chloe, who, it turned out, had been coming by twice a week the entire time, mowing the lawn herself between nursing school shifts, collecting the mail, watering the tomatoes Walter had built for me. Because, as she put it, standing in the driveway with her arms crossed against the June evening chill, somebody had to. That was the moment, I think, if I'm being honest with you, when the plan I'd been quietly assembling in my head over 11 hospital days stopped being an idea and became a decision. My son had built a life for the past 3 years on the assumption that I was too soft, too grateful, too old, and too sharp with numbers anymore to ever notice what he was doing, let alone stop it. My granddaughter had spent that same 3 years quietly loving me the only way she knew how, without asking for anything back, without a single receipt or screenshot ever being about protecting herself. I decided, standing in that driveway with a cane in one hand and Chloe's arm steadying the other, that whatever happened next, it was going to restore something for her, not just take something from him. He had already lost, though he had no idea yet. The one thing he'd never bothered to check was still his to lose in the first place. The weeks that followed my discharge settled into a rhythm I would later come to think of, quietly, as the calm before I let the storm I'd been assembling finally break. Daniel called twice during my first week home, both times leaving voicemails so carefully constructed they almost impressed me. "Mom, I know we need to talk. Things have been crazy. Call me when you're feeling up to it." No mention of the cruise. No mention of the lie about church. No mention, of course, of $45,000. I did not call him back. Not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because I understood, with the clarity Marcus Whitfield had helped me see, that the conversation I would eventually have with my son needed to happen on my terms, at a time of my choosing, once every piece was in place. A woman recovering from hip surgery, calling her son in tears to demand answers, was a woman he knew exactly how to handle. He had 30 years of practice managing me that way. A woman who said nothing at all, who let the silence stretch long enough for him to start wondering what it meant, was something he had never had to learn how to manage. Because I had never once, in 44 years of being his mother, made him learn it. Physical therapy became my daily discipline. 3 times a week at first, then twice. Miguel counting my steps down the hallway of the rehabilitation center with the patient enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed in incremental progress. My hip improved faster than the surgeon had predicted, which he credited to what he called motivation, though he had no idea what that motivation actually was. I walked the length of that hallway one week, leaning heavily on a walker, and by the following month, I was managing it with only a cane. And by the month after that, on good days, with nothing at all. Denise Calloway and I spoke by phone or in person nearly every week during that stretch, and the picture she helped me assemble grew more complete each time. The fraud review concluded formally in early August, confirming what we already knew, that $45,360 in transactions over the preceding 14 months had cleared without the verbal verification the account's protections required. Heritage Trust Bank, eager to limit its own liability for the coding error that had made it all possible, offered to reimburse a portion of the loss directly and to aggressively pursue recovery of the rest through Daniel's own accounts, since the bank's records clearly showed which card and whose name had authorized each transaction. I made my first trip back to Heritage Trust Bank in person on a Thursday morning in mid-July, 6 weeks after the surgery, walking in with only my cane, no walker, my charcoal cardigan buttoned neatly over a blouse Walter would have recognized from a dozen ordinary Sunday mornings. I had spoken to Denise Calloway a half dozen times by phone by then, her voice as familiar to me as a neighbor's. But I had never once seen her face, and there was something I needed. Some part of me that required proof this woman existed beyond a voice on a telephone line, before I could fully trust the next steps we were building together. She came around from behind her desk the moment she saw me in the doorway. A woman, perhaps 50, silver threading through dark hair pulled back neatly, reading glasses pushed up on her head exactly the way I had pictured them during our very first call. "Mrs. Voss," she said, extending her hand, and there was genuine warmth in it, not the practiced warmth of customer service, but something that felt, in that small lobby with its potted plants and its muted television playing financial news nobody was watching, almost like recognition between two people who had already been through something difficult together. "Miss Calloway," I said, "I thought it was time we finally met properly." She led me back to a small private office, closed the door, and set a thick folder on the desk between us, considerably thicker than anything she had described to me over the phone. "There's something I want to show you," she said, "that I didn't feel was appropriate to explain over an unsecured line. When I started digging into how that debit card got miscoded 2 years ago, I found something I think you deserve to know about." I sat very still, my cane resting against the arm of my chair, and waited. "You are not the only customer this happened to," Denise said quietly. "The same temporary employee who processed your son's card made an identical coding error on 3 other legacy pension trust accounts that same month, all of them belonging to elderly account holders, all of them with adult children or caregivers added as authorized users. 2 of those families caught it within a few months and had it corrected before any real damage was done. The 3rd did not." "What happened to the 3rd?" I asked, though something in her expression had already told me I would not like the answer. "An 83-year-old widow in the North Branch's service area," Denise said. "Her grandson had access to a similarly miscoded card for almost 2 years before anyone noticed. By the time it was caught, the amount taken was considerably higher than what your family took from you. I'm not able to share the exact figure with you for privacy reasons, but I can tell you it was well into 6 figures, and I can tell you that woman is now in a memory care facility, and the family dispute over what happened to her savings is still working its way through probate court." I sat with that for a long moment, the small office suddenly feeling very quiet around us, the muted television in the lobby beyond the glass wall flickering silently through headlines neither of us were watching. I thought about how close I had come, in my own quiet way, to becoming exactly that story. Not because I was foolish, not because I hadn't loved carefully, but because the world is simply full of small human errors made by tired, temporary employees during staffing shortages that quietly disable the safeguards good people spend decades building. And most families never find out until the damage has already calcified into something the courts have to untangle years later. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked her. "Because I think you should understand that what happened to you was not some isolated, unlucky accident," Denise said. "It was a systemic failure that this bank is directly responsible for, and that matters, Mrs. Voss, because it means you are not just a woman asking a favor from a sympathetic branch manager. You are a customer this institution failed, in a documented, provable way, and that gives you leverage you may not fully realize you have. I've already flagged this pattern to our regional compliance office. I intend to make sure it's fixed permanently for every account like yours in this system. But in the meantime, I want you walking into whatever comes next with your son knowing exactly how strong your position actually is." I left the bank that morning with a printed copy of the fraud review timeline tucked into my handbag, walking to my car under a July sky so bright and ordinary, it seemed almost indifferent to the weight of what I'd just learned. and I remember sitting behind the wheel for several minutes before I turned the key, thinking about that 83-year-old woman in the North Branch's service area, a stranger I would never meet, whose story had quietly become a kind of mirror for my own, showing me both how much worse this could have become and how much time I still had left to make sure it did not. I called Chloe from the parking lot before I drove home, because I needed, in that moment, to hear a voice that had never once treated my vulnerability as an opportunity. "I'm okay," I told her, before she could even ask. "I just learned something at the bank that reminded me how lucky I actually am, compared to how this could have gone." "Lucky isn't usually the word people use for what happened to you, Grandma," she said gently. "No," I agreed. "But it's the right word today. I have you. I have Marcus. I have a bank manager who cares more about doing right by her customers than protecting her own institution's reputation. Some people going through exactly what I'm going through don't have any of that. I think I owe it to that woman I'll never meet to make sure I use everything I do have." That conversation stayed with me through the rest of that summer, threading quietly through the physical therapy sessions and the phone calls and the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding a life on solid ground again. It was there, I think, underneath everything Marcus and Denise and I assembled together over the following weeks. A reminder that this was never really about punishing my son for its own sake. It was about making sure that whatever came next, for Chloe, for Bradley, for anyone else in this family who might one day find themselves as vulnerable as I had been lying in that hospital bed, the foundation would finally, actually, hold. "Mrs. Voss," Denise told me during one of those calls, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone on speaker while Chloe made us both tea. "I want you to understand that you have more leverage here than most people in your situation ever do, because the paper trail is clean. Every transaction has a timestamp, a merchant code, a card number. There's no ambiguity for anyone to hide behind." I revoked Daniel's authorized user status formally on the 4th of August, a Tuesday, the same day of the week I'd originally signed the paperwork that gave him access 3 years earlier. There was a certain symmetry to that I hadn't planned, but appreciated once I noticed it. I updated the beneficiary designation on the Legacy Pension Trust account that same afternoon, naming Chloe as primary beneficiary, with a smaller contingent share designated for Bradley, because whatever his parents had done, my grandson was 11 years old and not responsible for the choices made above his head. I was angry. I was not interested in becoming the kind of person who punished a child for his parents' greed. Marcus Whitfield drafted a formal demand letter that same week, one he explained would serve two purposes at once. It would notify Daniel, in clear and unambiguous legal language, that Heritage Trust Bank and I both considered the transactions in question unauthorized and were seeking restitution of the full amount within 30 days. And it would put him on notice, gently but unmistakably, that failure to respond would result in a formal report to Adult Protective Services alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. A report that, once filed, could not simply be undone by an apology and a promise to do better. "I don't want to destroy him," I told Marcus, sitting in his office with the letter spread across his desk between us, my cane hooked over the arm of the chair. "I want him to feel exactly 1% of what I felt lying in that hospital bed, scrolling past a photograph of my own family enjoying a vacation my pain had paid for. 1%. That's all I'm asking the universe for." "Then let's make sure he feels it," Marcus said, in a way he can't argue his way out of. Marcus leaned back in his chair and pulled a second folder from his desk drawer, one I had not seen before, thinner than the one holding the demand letter, but somehow more serious in the way it sat there between us. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want to walk you through exactly what a report to Adult Protective Services actually triggers. because I think it matters that you go into this with your eyes open, not just your heart." He explained it to me slowly, the way Walter used to explain fire department procedures at our kitchen table, patiently, without condescension, trusting me to understand every piece of it if he simply gave me the time. Under the state's Elder Financial Exploitation Statute, a formal report would open an independent investigation, separate entirely from the bank's own fraud review, conducted by a caseworker whose sole responsibility was determining whether a vulnerable adult had been financially exploited by someone in a position of trust. If the findings supported that conclusion, and Marcus was confident, given the paper trail Denise had already assembled, that they would, the report would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for a determination on criminal charges, entirely outside of my control at that point, regardless of whether I later changed my mind. "I need you to understand that distinction clearly," Marcus said. "The demand letter and the civil restitution agreement, those are things you control. You can forgive that debt tomorrow if you decide to. The Adult Protective Services report is different. Once it's filed, it belongs to the state. I've seen families assume they can pull it back once emotions cool down, and they cannot. I want you making that decision with total clarity, not in the heat of a Labor Day barbecue." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I used to turn over a difficult lesson plan, testing it from every angle before I brought it in front of 26 eight-year-olds who would ask questions I hadn't anticipated. "I don't think I'm ready to file that report yet," I told him finally. "I think I want him to have the chance to make this right first, on his own, before the state gets involved. If he doesn't take that chance, then I'll know I gave it to him honestly." "That's fair," Marcus said. "And frankly, it's more mercy than a lot of people in your position choose to extend. I'll draft the demand letter to include a clear restitution timeline, 30 days, with the Adult Protective Services language present but conditional, so he understands exactly what path he's choosing by how he responds." It was during that same week that Daniel called me for what would turn out to be the last time before the barbecue, on a Wednesday evening while I was sitting at my kitchen table sorting through mail Chloe had finally caught up on collecting. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something in me, some old habit 38 years deep, made me answer instead. "Mom, hey," he said, and his voice had the particular cheerful lightness he used when he wanted something. A tone I had heard my entire adult life, and had simply never allowed myself to name for what it was. "How's the hip? You sounding stronger every time we talk." "I'm managing," I said, and let the silence stretch just slightly longer than was comfortable, the way Marcus had coached me to, listening rather than filling space. "Listen, so this is a little awkward, but Vanessa and I were going over the numbers this month, and with the hospital copays from your surgery still trickling in, and Bradley's soccer fees, and honestly, the last few months have just been tight. We were wondering if you might be able to help out with a few things, just until things even out. Nothing crazy. Maybe 500 if you can swing it." I want you to understand something about the woman I had become by that point. Sitting at my own kitchen table, Kane resting against the chair beside me, a demand letter for $45,000 quietly waiting in an attorney's office across town. I did not correct him. I did not tell him what I already knew, what Denise had already confirmed, what Marcus was already preparing to formalize in writing. I let him believe, for a few more days, that his mother was still the same soft, grateful, easily managed woman he had spent 3 years assuming she would always be. "Let me see what I can do," I told him instead, my voice pitched just slightly higher, just slightly more uncertain than my actual voice, The voice I imagined a woman still doped up on painkillers and grateful for any attention from her son might use. "You know I always want to help if I can, sweetheart." "You're the best, Mom, seriously," he said. And I could hear, underneath the relief in his voice, the particular ease of a man who had never once had to work very hard to get what he wanted from me. "I knew you'd understand. Things have just been so crazy since the cruise, catching up on everything." He said it so easily. The cruise. As though it were an ordinary vacation, a well-earned family getaway, rather than $18,460 lifted from an unconscious woman's hospital bed. I sat with the phone against my ear and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The same stillness I had felt reading that photograph caption on the tray table weeks earlier. "Of course, dear," I said. "I'll see what I can put together." I hung up the phone and sat at that table for a long time afterward, my tea going cold in front of me, and I felt, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, a small flicker of something that was not quite guilt, but sat uncomfortably close to it. I had just lied to my own son, deliberately, strategically. I had let him believe I was weaker and more confused than I actually was, because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me slightly, that the truth would only warn him, and I was not yet ready for him to be warned. Chloe found me still sitting there 20 minutes later, and when I told her what had happened, she set her backpack down slowly and studied my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Are you okay with that?" she asked. "Playing along like that?" I thought about it honestly before I answered her, because I owed her honesty, always, even when the honest answer was complicated. "I don't love it," I told her. "It doesn't feel like who I've spent my whole life trying to be. But I think there's a difference between deception that harms someone and a strategic silence that simply protects the truth until it can do the most good. Your grandfather used to say that the people who taught him the most about fighting fires were the ones who understood you don't run into a burning building the moment you see smoke. You watch. You learn where the fire actually is, and then you go in with exactly the tools you need, not a moment before you're ready." "That's a very grandpa thing to say," Chloe said, with the ghost of a smile. "He was a very wise man," I said. "I'm only sorry it's taken me 3 years to start listening properly to the things he tried to teach me before he died." I did not send Daniel the $500. I did not need to explain why, not directly, because Denise had completed the formal revocation of his authorized user status the day before, and the card he would have used to make that withdrawal simply stopped working the next time he tried it. A small, quiet failure he apparently attributed, according to what Chloe heard secondhand, to a temporary bank error rather than anything more deliberate. He had no reason yet to suspect otherwise. That, I understood, was precisely the point. The days leading up to Labor Day settled into their own particular rhythm of quiet, deliberate preparation. The kind Marcus had described to me as building a case rather than building a grudge. Denise finalized the fraud review documentation into a single, clean summary I could carry with me if I needed it. Every transaction dated, itemized, and cross-referenced against the account's protection clause. Marcus prepared 2 versions of the demand letter, one gentler, one considerably less so, and left the choice of which to send entirely in my hands, depending, he said, on how the barbecue actually unfolded. I spent one particular Sunday afternoon that week sitting on Walter's swing behind the tomato beds, the one he'd built for Chloe all those years earlier, watching the late summer light move slow and gold across the yard. And I thought about the woman I had been 3 years ago, signing paperwork at a bank without reading every line, trusting easily, loving without boundaries, mistaking silence for peace. I did not regret loving my son. I want to be clear about that, even now. But I understood, sitting on that swing with my cane resting against the fence beside me, that love without structure had nearly cost me everything Walter had spent decades building to protect, and that the version of myself walking into that barbecue would not make that particular mistake again. Bradley called me twice that week, too. Small, ordinary conversations about his soccer season and a book he was reading for school. And I found myself listening to his voice with a tenderness that had nothing to do with the reckoning coming for his parents. Whatever happened at that barbecue, I promised myself, sitting on that swing in the fading gold light, it would not cost that boy anything he had not already, quietly, and without knowing it, begun to earn back on his own. We did not send the letter immediately. I asked Marcus to hold it, because I had one more piece I wanted in place first, and it required patience I had spent 3 years practicing without knowing why. Bradley's 6th grade year at the private school was set to begin in early September, tuition due the last week of August, $1,200 a month that Daniel had, for over a year, been drawing directly from my pension account under the framing of a loan he never repaid. I wanted the freeze in effect before that tuition payment came due, not after, because I understood, in the cold, clear way I now understood most things about my son, that nothing would crack the surface of his denial faster than money, simply, quietly, no longer being there when he reached for it. There was also the matter of the family gathering. Vanessa, apparently oblivious to how much silence had been building on my end, had already begun planning a Labor Day barbecue at their house, an event that would, according to the invitation Chloe forwarded me from the family group chat, double as a celebration of Bradley making the middle school soccer team and, in Vanessa's words, finally getting Grandma out and about again since her surgery. I read that message 3 times. Getting Grandma out and about again, as though my recovery were a project they had generously overseen from 3,000 miles away on a cruise ship. I decided that Labor Day barbecue was exactly where this needed to happen. Not because I wanted an audience, not really, not in the way you might expect from a story like this one. I decided it because I understood something Marcus Whitfield had said to me weeks earlier, about gravity doing what gravity does once you remove what was propping something up. My son and his wife had built an entire identity in front of their friends, their neighbors, their extended family, as generous, comfortable, thriving people, a couple who could afford country clubs and cruises and private schools on Daniel's mid-level insurance salary and Vanessa's boutique fitness classes. That identity was a house built on my foundation, and I intended to remove the foundation in front of the same audience that had watched them build it. Chloe helped me get ready that morning, helping me into a simple charcoal dress, the kind of understated, tailored thing I had not worn since Walter's funeral. And something about putting it on again, standing straighter than I had in months, made me feel, for the first time since that photograph on the hospital tray table, entirely like myself again. "You don't have to do this today, Grandma," Chloe said gently, watching me in the mirror as I fastened a small silver pin, one Walter had given me on our 30th anniversary, to my collar. "We can wait. There's no rush." "There's every rush," I told her. Your grandfather built a foundation strong enough to survive people trying to walk out the door with it. It's time your father understood exactly how strong that foundation really is. We arrived at Daniel and Vanessa's house a little after 2 in the afternoon, the driveway already lined with cars, the smell of charcoal and grilled corn drifting across a lawn strung with string lights for later. Vanessa met us at the door in a sundress that would not have looked out of place on that cruise ship deck, all bright teeth and performed warmth. "Eleanor, look at you, walking so well already. We were just saying how worried we were." "Were you?" I said and smiled, and let her lead me inside. Daniel found me 20 minutes later near the drinks table, a beer in his hand, tanned in a way that told me the cruise had left its mark on more than just his credit history. "Mom," he said, leaning in for a hug I accepted stiffly. "You look great. Really great." "I feel wonderful," I said, and I meant it, in a way he could not possibly understand yet. "Recovery has given me a lot of time to think." Something flickered behind his eyes, some faint animal instinct sensing weather changing before the sky itself had visibly darkened. But he covered it quickly, the way he always had, with a laugh and a change of subject. He had no idea that in exactly 40 minutes, everything he had spent 3 years quietly building was going to collapse in front of every person on that lawn. The afternoon unfolded the way these afternoons do, deceptively pleasant, full of small talk about the weather and Bradley's soccer schedule and a neighbor's new patio, while I stood near the edge of the yard with a plate of food I mostly didn't eat, watching my son move through his own party like a man who owned the sunlight. Vanessa gave a toast around 3:30, glass raised, praising Bradley's soccer season and, almost as an afterthought, thanking everyone who made our little getaway this summer possible. A line that drew a ripple of polite, uncomprehending laughter from guests who assumed she meant a babysitter, or a travel agent, or simply good luck. I raised my own glass along with everyone else, and I felt Chloe's hand find mine at my side, steady, waiting. It was Daniel who gave me the opening, not intentionally, but the way these things almost always happen. A small crack in a conversation that widens the moment you decide to put weight on it. He found me again near the drinks table around 4, and this time there was something more deliberate in the way he approached, a folder tucked under his arm that I recognized instantly for what it was, because I had seen enough legal paperwork over the past 11 days to know the shape of it from across a lawn. "Mom, since you're feeling so much better," he said, with the particular breeziness of a man rehearsing a request he'd expected to be easy. "Vanessa and I were talking, and honestly, given everything with your hip and, you're not getting any younger, we think it might make sense to get you added to a full power of attorney. Not just the account stuff, everything. The house, the car, all of it. Just so somebody's looking out for you properly if anything else happens." He held the folder out toward me, and I understood, in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost merciful in its simplicity, exactly what my son had been planning this entire time. He had not called to check on me during 11 days in the hospital because he was ashamed. He had stayed away because he was busy assembling the paperwork to formalize, permanently, the access to my life he had already been quietly exploiting for 3 years. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, and I did not take the folder. "But I don't think that's going to be necessary." "Mom, come on. Don't be stubborn about this. It's for your own protection." "Daniel," I said, and something in my voice made 3 or 4 nearby conversations quietly go still, the way a room does when it senses, before it understands why, that something important is about to happen. "I've already spoken with an attorney about protecting myself. I think you'll find the protections I've put in place are quite thorough." His smile faltered, just slightly, a hairline crack in a surface that had never once had to hold weight before. What are you talking about? I reached into my handbag and drew out a small stack of papers I had carried with me all afternoon, folded neatly, waiting. Not the demand letter itself. Marcus had advised me to hold that for a formal delivery, but a summary he had prepared for exactly this moment, in case I chose to use it. A single page listing the total unauthorized transactions, the dates, the amounts, in language plain enough that anyone standing on that lawn could understand it in one reading. 3 days ago, I said, my voice level, unhurried, the same voice I had used for 38 years to quiet a classroom without ever raising it. I received formal confirmation from Heritage Trust Bank that $45,360 was withdrawn from my pension account over the past 14 months without my authorization. That includes $18,460 charged to a cruise booked while I was unconscious in an operating room, having my hip repaired. The lawn had gone entirely silent now, the string lights swaying gently in a breeze nobody was paying attention to. 40 or 50 guests suddenly very interested in a conversation they'd been polite enough to ignore 30 seconds earlier. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice dropping, urgent now, glancing around at the guests watching. "Can we not do this here?" "You did this here," I said. "You did all of it here, or somewhere very much like it, for 3 years. And you never once thought to ask whether I might mind. I think it's fair that the conversation about it happens here, too." Vanessa had appeared at his side now, her sundress suddenly looking less like celebration and more like a costume she badly wanted to remove. "Eleanor, I really don't think this is the time or place. You told your friend, in a text message my granddaughter happened to see, that Bradley's father and I would fund your, and I'm quoting here, little nest egg," I said, turning to her with the same level calm. "I think this is precisely the time and place." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and uncomfortable. 40 pairs of eyes moving between Daniel's reddening face and my own composed one, waiting to see which way the afternoon would break. I felt Chloe's hand tighten around mine, not with worry, I realized, but with something closer to pride. "You lied to me about being at church," I said quietly, almost gently to my son, the man I had raised, the boy I had once bandaged skinned knees for and stayed up with through fevers, and driven to college with a car full of everything he owned. While you were on a ship I paid for, recovering from a fraud you committed against your own mother while she was in surgery. I want you to understand something, Daniel. I am not exactly sharp with numbers anymore. Is that what you used to say to people? Let's see how sharp the bank's fraud department turns out to be. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, closed it again, opened it a second time, the particular pantomime of a man searching for a defense that did not exist. Around us, the barbecue had fully stopped being a barbecue. Somewhere behind me, I heard the hiss of forgotten burgers scorching on the grill nobody was tending anymore. And closer, the low murmur of guests leaning toward each other, the way people do when they realize they are witnessing something they will be describing to other people for years to come. "This is insane," Vanessa said, her voice climbing toward a register I had never once heard her use. Not in 3 years of holiday dinners and stiff, performative hugs. "You're humiliating us in front of everyone we know over some misunderstanding about a family account, Eleanor. Honestly, is this really the woman Walter married? Someone who'd do this to her own son at a party?" I turned to her slowly, and I want you to understand, if you have never had the particular experience of being underestimated for most of your adult life, how strange and how clarifying it feels the first time you finally let someone see exactly how wrong they've been. Walter married a woman who taught third grade for 38 years, I said. A woman who spent her entire career explaining to small children that taking something that isn't yours has consequences, even when you're certain nobody's paying close enough attention to notice. I don't know what you thought that woman would do forever, Vanessa, but I can tell you she is done pretending not to notice. A man near the drinks table, someone I recognized vaguely as a colleague of Daniel's from the insurance office, cleared his throat and took a small step back, the universal instinct of a bystander realizing he has wandered too close to something private. Another woman, one of the country club wives whose name I'd never bothered to learn, had her phone half raised, filming perhaps, or perhaps simply frozen with it in her hand, unsure whether this was the kind of moment you were supposed to record or the kind you were supposed to pretend you hadn't seen. I spoke with my attorney this morning, I said, and I let the words land the way Marcus had coached me to, unhurried, factual, without a single trace of theater in my delivery, because the truth, I had learned, needed no theater to be devastating. He has prepared a formal letter that will be delivered to your home this week, requesting restitution of the full amount within 30 days. I want to be honest with both of you about what happens if that 30 days passes without a response. The letter also puts you on notice that failure to make good on what was taken will result in a report to Adult Protective Services, alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I am telling you this here, in front of these people, not to embarrass you, though I understand that it will. I am telling you because I think you have spent 3 years assuming I would never actually follow through on anything. And I want there to be no confusion, this time, about exactly how serious I am. The phrase landed across that lawn like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through the crowd in visible waves, small gasps, a low exchange of whispers, someone murmuring, "Adult Protective Services," to the person beside them in the particular hushed tone people use for words they've only ever heard in the context of someone else's family, never their own. "You would actually do that," Daniel said, and something in his voice had shifted now, the confidence gone entirely, replaced by something rawer, something closer to disbelief. "You'd report your own son, to the state." "I would rather you never make me follow through on it," I said. "That decision belongs entirely to you. It always has. I have given you 30 days, Daniel, and a chance, an actual chance, to make this right before it becomes something neither of us can undo. I would think very carefully, if I were you, about how you choose to spend them." Vanessa's hand found her chest, a theatrical gesture that might once, 3 years earlier, have moved me to soften, to comfort, to smooth over whatever discomfort I had caused, simply because discomfort in others had always felt, to me, like something I was personally responsible for fixing. It did not move me now. "This is going to ruin us," she said, her voice cracking, and I watched several of the guests exchange a glance that told me plainly they were beginning, for the first time, to wonder exactly what us had actually been built on this entire time. "I did not ruin anything," I said quietly. "I simply stopped paying for it." Daniel looked at me, and for one long, suspended moment, something passed across his face that I had not expected to see there. Not that day. Not on that lawn, surrounded by every friend and neighbor he had spent 3 years impressing with a life he had never actually earned. It looked, unmistakably, like the boy I remembered from 30 years earlier, caught in some smaller lie, waiting to learn whether his mother's love was conditional on his honesty or simply unconditional enough to absorb whatever he did next. "Mom," he said again, quieter this time. "Please?" I did not answer please with mercy, not in that moment, Though I want you to know I felt the old pull of it, the familiar gravitational tug of 38 years spent making things easier for the people I loved. I felt it, and I let it pass through me without taking hold, the way Marcus had once described watching a fire from a safe distance, understanding its heat without letting it decide what you do next. You lied to me about being at church, I said again, quietly, letting the words settle over the silent lawn one final time. While you were on a ship I paid for. His face had gone the color of old paper. Somewhere behind him, I saw Bradley, standing near the fence with his soccer teammates, his face open in a kind of dawning, mortified confusion. An 11-year-old suddenly understanding that the ground under his family's comfortable life was not as solid as he'd been raised to believe. Daniel had walked toward me across that lawn 30 seconds ago, carrying a folder meant to expand his control over my entire life. He was about to learn exactly how little control he actually had left. The 40 or 50 people scattered across that lawn had gone very quiet, the kind of silence you could hear the ice melting in someone's abandoned drink through. And into that silence, my son's voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "Mom, please, can we go inside and talk about this like adults?" "We are talking about it like adults," I said. "I'm simply not willing to have it privately anymore. The way I've had every other conversation in this family privately for 3 years, so that you could go on smiling in front of everyone while I quietly absorbed whatever you decided I could afford." Vanessa's composure had cracked entirely now, her hand gripping Daniel's arm, her voice pitched higher, defensive. "You don't understand how hard things have been for us, Eleanor. Daniel's commissions have been unpredictable. We were going to pay you back." "With what?" I asked, and I let the question sit there, unanswered, because there was no honest answer available. "You've had 3 years and $45,000 of opportunities to pay me back. And instead, you booked a cruise the same week I was scheduled for surgery, because, and I have this in writing from a conversation my granddaughter overheard, you thought I would be, and I'm quoting again, too doped up on painkillers to check her statements for weeks." A gasp rippled through several of the nearby guests. A genuine, unrehearsed sound. And I watched a woman I recognized as one of Vanessa's boutique gym clients take a small, involuntary step backward, the way you do from something you've just realized is on fire. Daniel's face had drained of the tan he'd brought home from that Caribbean deck. "Chloe told you that," he said, turning toward his daughter with a look I can only describe as betrayal, as though she were the one who had done something wrong. "Of course she did. She's always hated Vanessa. She's always looking for a way to cause problems." "Don't," Chloe said, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than I had ever heard it. Steady in a way that told me she had been waiting 3 years to say this exact word. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. I have spent 2 years watching you take money from a woman who has never once asked either of us for a single thing back, and I stayed quiet because every time I tried to say something, you told me I was jealous. I'm not jealous, Dad. I'm just the only one in this family who ever actually paid attention." The silence that followed her words felt different from the silence before it, heavier somehow. The silence of a family portrait finally being seen for what it had always actually contained. I watched Bradley step away from his teammates and cross the lawn toward his father, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that looked, painfully, like the beginning of disillusionment. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly with the particular awkwardness of 11. "Is that true? Is that where the cruise money came from?" Daniel did not answer him. That silence, more than anything I had said, more than the demand letter waiting in Marcus Whitfield's office, more than the $45,000 itself, seemed to be the moment the entire lawn understood exactly what kind of afternoon this had become. I did not raise my voice for the rest of the conversation. I did not need to. "As of the 4th of August, I said, "your access to my pension account has been formally revoked. The bank has opened a fraud investigation into every unauthorized withdrawal made over the past 14 months. My attorney has prepared a formal demand for restitution of the full amount, which will be delivered to you this week, and which gives you 30 days to respond before a report is filed with Adult Protective Services alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Vanessa made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, disbelieving, the particular sound of a person watching a story about themselves that they had never imagined being told from this angle. "Adult Protective Services? Eleanor, that's insane! We're your family!" "Family," I said, and for the first time all afternoon, something sharp slipped into my voice, quick and cold as a blade drawn and put away again in the same motion. "Does not book a cruise around a surgery date. Family does not tell a hospitalized mother they're at church while a gull cries in the background of a ship 3,000 miles away. Family does not call an elderly woman's own granddaughter jealous for keeping a record of the truth." Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out cracked, smaller than the confident man who'd approached me 40 minutes earlier, with a folder full of expanded control. "Mom, please. We'll pay it back, whatever we can. Please, just don't file anything. Please, think about what this would do to us. I have spent 11 days in a hospital bed, and 3 years before that thinking about what things do to other people, Daniel," I said. "I would like, for once, for someone in this family to spend 30 days thinking about what things do to me." I turned to Chloe, who was already reaching for my arm, steadying me the way she had steadied me down 100 hospital hallways over the preceding weeks. "I think we're finished here," I said. We left that lawn in silence, 40 or 50 guests parting slightly to let us through, the string lights swaying overhead in a breeze that had picked up while nobody was paying attention to the weather. And behind us, I heard Vanessa's voice rising and Daniel's cracking, and somewhere underneath both of them, a low, mortified murmur beginning to move through the crowd like water finding the lowest point in a room. He had spent 3 years assuming I would never notice. And 30 seconds ago, in front of everyone who mattered to him, he had learned exactly how wrong that assumption had been. The 30 days Marcus Whitfield's demand letter allowed turned out to be some of the loudest, most instructive weeks of my entire life, though I spent most of them in a quiet I had grown to genuinely enjoy. The letter itself went out the Tuesday after Labor Day, delivered by certified mail to Daniel and Vanessa's front door, formally itemizing every unauthorized transaction, the total sum owed, and the 30-day window before a report to Adult Protective Services and, separately, a civil suit for restitution would follow. Daniel called 11 times in the first week. I answered 3 of those calls, briefly, because Marcus had advised me it was wise to remain minimally responsive rather than appear to be avoiding communication entirely. A distinction, he explained, that could matter if this ever moved into a courtroom. Each call followed roughly the same arc: denial, softening into pleading, softening further into a kind of bewildered anger that seemed to genuinely believe I was overreacting to what he still, astonishingly, described as a misunderstanding about how the account worked. "Mom, you make it sound like I robbed a bank," he said during the second call, his voice raw in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in some smaller, more forgivable lie. "I'm your son. I was helping you. Things just got a little out of hand." $45,000 is not a little out of hand, Daniel, I said. $45,000 is a decision made repeatedly over 14 months by a grown man who understood exactly what he was doing and simply believed his mother would never add it up. He had no real answer for that, because there wasn't one. What followed those first few calls was a period Marcus had warned me to expect. One he referred to, with the dry humor of a man who had seen this pattern many times before, as the collapse sequence. Denial gives way to panic once the reality of consequences becomes unavoidable. Panic gives way to bargaining, then to a kind of theatrical hysteria designed to make the wronged party feel guilty enough to relent. And finally, when none of that works, to silence. Vanessa called me exactly once, 3 weeks into that 30-day window, her voice trembling in a way that struck me, even then, as more performance than genuine remorse. "Eleanor, please, I know you're angry, but Bradley's tuition is due, and if we can't access those funds, he's going to have to leave the school mid-semester. Do you understand what that would do to him socially? To switch schools right now?" "I understand exactly what that would do to him," I said. "It's the same thing that happens to any child whose parents build a life on money that was never actually theirs. Eventually, the foundation gets removed, and everyone standing on it has to find somewhere else to stand." She hung up on me that time, which I found, if I'm honest, something close to a relief. There is a particular exhaustion in being asked, over and over, to feel guilty for a betrayal that was never your doing, and her silence after that call was the first genuinely peaceful moment I'd had with either of them in weeks. Bradley called me directly during that stretch too, which surprised me more than anything else that happened that month. He called on a Thursday evening, his voice young and uncertain in a way that reminded me, painfully, of Daniel at that same age. "Grandma," he said, "I didn't know about the money. I want you to know that. I didn't know any of it was from you." "I know you didn't," I told him, and I meant it, because whatever anger I carried for his parents had never once extended to him. "None of this is your fault, Bradley. You're allowed to still love your parents and also understand that what they did was wrong. Both of those things can be true at the same time." "Is it true you're not paying for school anymore?" "It's true that I'm not paying for anything anymore that I never actually agreed to pay for," I said gently. "Your parents will need to figure out the rest, and I trust them to do that, because they're capable adults who are simply going to have to start acting like it." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "I want to come visit you sometime. Just me. Is that okay?" "That," I told him, "would make me very happy." The tuition crisis, as it turned out, became the first tangible domino to fall. Without access to my account, and with the fraud investigation now formally documented at Heritage Trust Bank, Daniel and Vanessa found themselves scrambling to cover a $1,200 monthly payment they had, for over a year, simply assumed would continue indefinitely. Bradley finished the semester at his private school on a payment plan Daniel arranged directly with the administration, humiliatingly, according to Chloe, who heard about it through a mutual family friend, requiring him to explain to the school's business office exactly why funds he'd previously drawn on had suddenly disappeared. The country club membership lapsed within the month, quietly, without announcement, the kind of small social erosion that spreads through a circle of friends faster than any confrontation ever could. Vanessa's gym membership went next, and I heard, again through Chloe, that she had stopped attending the boutique fitness classes she'd once posted about weekly, likely because the $89 monthly fee had become, for the first time in 3 years, an actual decision rather than an automatic draft from an account that wasn't hers. The truck payment was the one that finally broke something loose in Daniel, according to what he eventually admitted to me weeks later. 2 months without the $410 he'd quietly been drawing to cover it, and the vehicle was repossessed from their driveway on a Tuesday morning, in full view of the neighbors he and Vanessa had spent 3 years impressing with a lifestyle that had never actually been theirs to fund. I did not gloat over any of this. I want to be honest with you about that too, because it would be easy, in telling this story, to let myself sound triumphant in a way that isn't quite true to how I actually felt. Watching my son's life visibly contract, piece by piece, over those 30 days did not feel like victory. It felt like watching gravity do exactly what Marcus Whitfield had promised it would do, patiently, mechanically, without any cruelty on my part required at all. I had simply stopped propping something up that was never mine to hold in the first place. On the 28th day of the 30-day window, Daniel showed up at my house unannounced, standing on the porch in the late September light looking smaller than I had seen him look in years, his shoulders hunched, his hands empty this time, no folder, no confident smile, nothing at all in front of him to hide behind. "Mom," he said, "can I come in? I don't want to argue. I just want to talk." I let him in. I made tea, because some habits from 38 years of teaching children how to behave with grace do not simply disappear because you're furious at your own son. And we sat at the same kitchen table where he had once, 3 years earlier, offered to help me manage my accounts. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally, staring into his cup rather than at me. "I know I can't pay back $45,000 right now. I know I've probably ruined how you see me forever. I keep trying to figure out when exactly I decided this was okay, and I can't find the moment. It just sort of happened, a little at a time, and every time I told myself it was temporary, and then it wasn't, and by the time it was this big, I didn't know how to say anything without admitting how bad it had gotten." It was, I think, the first entirely honest thing my son had said to me in 3 years. "I believe you," I told him, and I did, in a strange way, because I understood something about the slow erosion of boundaries that he perhaps did not yet see clearly about himself. I believe it happened a little at a time. That doesn't change what it added up to, or who it hurt, or how many times you looked me in the eye, or 3,000 miles away over a phone line and lied to me while it was happening. "What do you want from me?" he asked. And for the first time, it did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like an actual question from a man who genuinely did not know the answer. "I want a repayment plan, in writing, through Mr. Whitfield's office, with real terms and real consequences if they aren't met," I said. "I want you to apologize to Chloe, properly, for 3 years of dismissing her when she was the only one in this family telling you the truth. And I want you to understand, going forward, that I am not a foundation you get to build your life on top of without asking. I am your mother. I love you. Those 2 things have never been in conflict, and they are not in conflict now. But they are also not the same thing, and I need you to finally understand the difference." He cried then, at my kitchen table, in a way I had not seen him cry since he was a small boy, and I let him, because grief, even grief for your own bad choices, deserves somewhere to land. We did not resolve everything that afternoon. Some things, I've learned, take longer than a single conversation, however honest, to fully repair. But it was, I understood even then, the first true foundation stone of whatever our relationship was going to become from that point forward. And unlike the last one, this one, at least, was being built with both of us finally looking at exactly what was real. 6 months pass the way they do once the worst of a storm has finally broken, and the slow work of rebuilding begins, quietly, unglamorously, one ordinary day layered on top of another. I want to tell you where everyone ended up, because I think you've earned the ending, after sitting with me through everything that came before it. I walk without a cane now, most days, except when the weather turns cold and my hip reminds me, gently, that it remembers what happened to it. Physical therapy ended in November, Miguel shaking my hand at our final session and telling me, with what I choose to believe was genuine sincerity, that I was one of the most determined patients he'd worked with all year. I did not tell him what exactly I'd been determined about. Some things a person earns the right to keep private, even from the people who helped her heal. The legacy pension trust account my husband Walter built decades ago, the one with the cosigner clause that finally did exactly what he'd intended it to do, has been fully restored, its safeguards corrected, the coding error that allowed the original breach permanently fixed by Heritage Trust Bank, who, in the end, reimbursed $12,000 of the loss directly as an acknowledgement of their own error, with the remaining balance being repaid, slowly, monthly, by my son, through a formal restitution agreement drafted by Marcus Whitfield and signed, notarized, and witnessed, the way Walter always believed things that mattered should be. Chloe graduated from her nursing program in December, and I sat in the third row of that auditorium in my charcoal dress, the silver pin from Walter fastened at my collar, and I cried through her entire name being called. The kind of crying that has nothing to do with grief at all. She has moved in with me now, temporarily, she says, though we both suspect it will end up being longer than either of us admits out loud. And some evenings, we sit at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold, while we talk about nothing in particular. The exact rhythm Walter and I once had, passed down now to a granddaughter who earned every ounce of the trust I've placed in her. Bradley visits every other weekend, just him, the way he asked for that Thursday evening on the phone. He is, I have discovered, a genuinely thoughtful young man underneath 3 years of a household that taught him the wrong things about money and family without ever meaning to. He helped me plant new tomatoes this spring, in the raised beds his grandfather built. And he asked me questions about Walter I don't think anyone else in his family had ever thought to ask him. Daniel and Vanessa sold their house in March, downsizing to a smaller place across town. The country club membership and the boutique gym classes and the vacations quietly replaced by a life closer to what their actual income could honestly support. It was not an easy adjustment for either of them, from what I understand. And I did not make it easier, though I also did not make it harder than the truth already required. Daniel sends a payment every month, on time, through Marcus Whitfield's office, and calls me every Sunday now, genuinely, not from a ship with a gull crying in the background, but from wherever he actually is, which has become, slowly, a habit built on honesty instead of performance. We are not what we once were, my son and I. I don't know that we ever will be again, not entirely. And I've made a kind of peace with that. The way you make peace with a scar that healed but never quite disappeared. But we are rebuilding, brick by brick, on a foundation that is finally, for the first time in years, made of something true. I think often, these days, about the woman I was lying in that hospital bed, scrolling past a photograph that broke something open in me I didn't know was still capable of breaking. I think about how easy it would have been to stay quiet, to let the hurt sit there unspoken, the way I'd let 3 years of smaller hurts sit unspoken before it. Because speaking up felt, for so long, like it might cost me the only family I had left. What I learned instead, and what I hope if you've stayed with me this long you'll carry with you too, is that silence does not actually protect the people we love from consequences. It only protects them from having to face those consequences while we're still standing there to soften the landing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people who have wronged you is to finally, calmly, without cruelty and without apology, let gravity do what gravity was always going to do. I loved my son through every single one of those $45,000, even while I was taking every one of them back. Love and accountability, I've come to understand, were never opposites. They were always supposed to travel together, the way Walter and I did, at that same kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee going cold, while we made sure the foundation stayed strong enough to hold whatever came next. If you've ever had to draw a boundary with your own family, if you've ever had to choose between being liked and being respected, I hope you'll tell me about it in the comments below. Because I promise you, someone reading this needs to know they're not the only one who has had to learn that lesson the hard way. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, I would be so grateful if you'd hit like and subscribe, so more stories like mine can find the people who need to hear them. We are, all of us, stronger than the people who underestimate us ever expect. It simply takes some of us longer than others to prove it, and there is no shame at all in the time it takes to finally stand up and do it.